There was 3 marches. I participated in all of them. And then my senior year in high school, I heard Cesar Chavez speak. And what he had to say really resonated with me. People would come and talk about the need for getting an education as a young Latino, going to school, going to college, being a lawyer, teacher, doctor, coming back to the hood and helping our community. And that was all good. But when I heard Cesar Chavez speak, he was saying, you can make a difference now by participating in this national boycott of lettuce and grapes. And you could make a difference to the farm workers. And that created an interest in me to organize farm workers. So ever since then, pretty much, I've been active in the farm worker movement. I started working with the LA Boycott Committee. And then because of my upbringing in Los Angeles, I wanted to get out of LA. So I moved to Washington State. I got a scholarship there, at University of Washington. And up there I hooked up with the Seattle Boycott Committee and started organizing. And I also worked on the Fair Pants boycott that was organized by the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union. There was a strike going on in El Paso, Texas, in one of the maquilas there. It was all women that were making pants, Levi's, all kinds of Fair Pants. And so I participated. I was the regional organizer for that. I was like 18, 19 years old. But I was active in the student movement, so I was able to mobilize students to boycott some of the department stores there. So I was doing that, and at the same time working with a boycott, with a great boycott, Gallo boycott. I lost interest in going to school. I took classes that would allow me to further my organizing skills. So I took a lot of communication courses. I learned photography. I learned how to do a newsletter. I learned TV production and radio production. And so a lot of what I learned, I've been able to use organizing today. Pecún has a 24-hour FM radio station. It's Radio Movimiento La Voz del Pueblo. I really pushed hard for the union to apply for FCC license because the power of the radio is a very important organizing tool. It develops leadership. And we've seen during the marches around the Sensenbrenner bill that millions of people poured out in the street. And a key component of that were these disc jockeys from around the country, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, and other places where they were mobilizing hundreds of thousands of people. And so we knew that the radio is a powerful tool to organize and mobilize. And I learned that in school. And I also applied a lot of the skills I learned. My second year in college, I just lost complete interest and became an activist, which is something that I always wanted to do. I mean, I went to school with being an organizer in my mind. I had that because of my work with Cesar Chavez. And then I became an immigrant rights organizer because my family was affected by the raids that were going on. The raids in Los Angeles, well, all over the country, was organized under the Nixon administration. And he hired the ex-commandant for the U.S. Marine Corps, Leonard Chapman. And they launched this huge, massive campaign against undocumented immigrants. But behind that campaign was actually based on a report called the Corwin Report, which was Arthur Corwin was MIT sociologist that the Nixon administration had contracted with to do a study on the potential of the Southwest and the Chicano movement being a separatist movement similar to Quebec in Canada. What Corwin, in his report to the Nixon administration, said that, well, you need to curtail illegal immigration, and then you need to go after the Chicano militants. So it was the beginning of the COINTELPRO programs, which we've seen that destruction of social justice movements, the Black Panther movement, AIM, the American Indian movement, and the Chicano movement, and the Puerto Rican movement with the Young Lords Party. That was FBI stuff. And then on the other hand, we've seen massive deportations of US citizens in every major city in the country. That was in the early 70s. And so I became interested because many of the workers that I was working with at the time were undocumented. And my family and my sister's husband got deported. And so I joined a movement called CAPACES, which was led by Bert Corona, an old union activist from the 50s. He organized an organization that provided legal defense and mobilization for the community against these raids. And I became part of that movement at the same time working with the farm workers. And then I moved to Oregon because there was this new organization, the Willamette Valley Immigration Project. A member of CASA, and I came to Oregon to organize the Oregon chapter of CASA. Some of the better known people that you know of CASA is the mayor of LA, Antonio Villaraigosa, Maria Elena Durazo, Nativo Lopez, Rudy Lozano in Chicago. Those are some of the people that came out of the CASA movement. It was a national organization that fought for the rights of undocumented back in the 70s. A lot of my organizing skills came from CASA that taught me how to build structure, how to build organization, and how to use like important tools in the movement. And so it was study, mobilization, advocacy, propaganda, communications.
It was a very disciplined approach.
Very disciplined. It was almost like a political party. So I learned a lot about discipline. Well, the skill that I didn't have was organizing farm workers, because that's a very, very different skill. And I learned that skill from an organizer that grew up with Cesar Chavez and the Cesar Chavez family. And that was Cipriano Ferrer, the standing president of PECUN, and I was the vice president. I took over being president. But before that, I worked with him for 7 years in building the union here in Oregon. We're still independent. We worked a lot with the UFW and with other groups. In fact, one of the things we did was we visited different organizations, different unions around the country. There is only a handful of unions that are actually doing organizing work. What I mean by organizing is that they're organizing for collective bargaining rights, because that's where the true power lies. If you want to develop power for farm workers, you do it through collective bargaining, right? Farm workers are not covered by the National Labor Relations. And it's been that way because during the time that the National Labor Relations Act was formed back in the 1930s, farm workers were excluded because the deal got brokered. The unions were represented by the Northerners, and the big bosses were represented at the negotiating table by the Dixiecrats. Old plantation owners that represented the old South mentality of the continuation of the Jim Crow laws. In the 1930s, the majority of farm workers were black, African American. And so the deal was that they excluded farm workers from being part of the National Relations Act at the time. Said, we'll go with the deal, and then we'll pick up the farm workers later. Well, here we are, but 80 years later, we're still not covered. The jornaleros, the day laborers, and domestic workers aren't covered either. When I say that organizing farm workers is difficult, you don't have the legal mechanism. You don't go into a field and collect 51% of the cards or over 50% and then have an election, because nobody will respect it. And so for us, organizing means preparing people to go on strike, and then eventually using one advantage not being covered under the law is that we can do secondary boycotts. To get farm workers to that point,
what is
secondary boycott is that we can boycott other targets, right? For example, we can boycott the grower, strike on the grower, and also boycott the companies that buy the products.
So indirect.
Right, pressure. But to get the lowest paying, the hardest working farm workers in America to go out on strike, you have to be like super duty organizing, right? You gotta like really use creative methods. So Cipriano had a wealth of experience working early on with the UFW, and we learned a lot from him. And then we actually formed the union in '85.
The union is called
PECUN.
CASA?
And CASA is the Immigrant Rights Coalition, a combination of a statewide coalition, immigrant rights organization. And on its board, it has about 15 different organizations on it. Because of where we live in the Northwest, we have to build coalitions with other organizations. We have a member of the gay and lesbian community. Basic Rights of Oregon has a member of our board, which we invited because they were really helpful in helping us developing the structure and the campaign to defeat the 187 initiatives here in Oregon.
Yes.
We're really fortunate to have a group like the Rural Organizing Project because it's primarily a white human dignity group that has chapters in rural Oregon. They have some 40 or 50 small organizations. And they have taken on the issue of immigrant rights and made it part of their programmatic work. The bottom line is that they want to fight for democracy and human rights in Oregon. And 2010, I think we're over like 5,500 members who have joined the union. And we have now since grown into a movement of about 9 different organizations. So we're here in Oregon, primarily in the northern Willamette Valley. It's the largest agricultural producing area in the state. The agriculture industry is pretty powerful, and they've used every mechanism at their disposal to destroy our unionizing efforts. So we've had to defend ourselves, not only by going on strike and boycott. We led a 10-year boycott. But once we were able to gain some power, the growers went into the state legislature and tried to take our power away. They created some bills, especially targeted Pecún. And they had a rally, like about 600 growers with tractors and all that, and their signs were saying, "Governor, protect us from Pecún." They introduced a sham collective bargaining bill that took away our right to strike during harvest time. They would take our access away from farm workers. We couldn't go to visit farm workers in their place of employment. And then they took away the most powerful arm that we have, the right to boycott. And so the sham collective bargaining bill passed in the House and the Senate because both the houses were controlled by Republicans, but our governor was a Democrat and he vetoed it. That's when we learned that up to that point, we really didn't get involved in electoral politics, right?
Yes.
In registering voters or none of that. But when we seen that, we had to prepare ourselves to defend ourselves in the legislative process. And to do that, we had to develop a strategy. We had to develop an organization that would be like a PAC, Political Action Committee. We had to do lobbying. So we had to have a permanent presence now in the legislature and lobby, because the growers went after us. They tried to exclude farm workers from making minimum wage by getting a special exemption. So we had to organize ourselves to be at the legislature, talk to senators and House reps, and they almost passed it. We won the vote the first time by only one vote. He was a fisherman, and he was casting the last vote, and he was shaky by that because the agricultural interests were
after him.
Where he killed it. And we helped defeat it probably 2 or 3 other times. One of the things that we tell organizations that are emerging, that they get to a certain point and they start developing some power, your opposition is going to come after you hard. That's what happened to us. So that's why we're involved in voter registration, voter education, GOTV. We have a PAC, you know, because we have to defend ourselves. Years after we formed a union, we signed our first collective bargaining agreements with a blueberry grower. And then that year we signed 4 other agreements. In our life, we've had about 9 or 10 agreements. And then the second year we were preparing for the growing season, and then the grower says, "Wow, sorry, I got bad news. The cannery's closing down because they're not going to plant in Oregon. They're going to buy their pickles from Sri Lanka."
Whoa.
It was cheaper to pay the workers and then ship them over here, all the way across the world. So
amazing.
We lost that contract.
So it's a constant struggle to keep.
And then with free trade in Oregon, we've lost about 60% of our crops. They've moved south to Central America, Mexico, Central America, and Latin America. A lot of our raspberries that we used to grow here are grown in Chile and Mexico. Strawberries, for example, are almost all grown in Mexico now. So we've lost a lot of broccoli, cauliflower, the same. So agriculture now is really shrinking. We do have a booming nursery industry, horticulture, but even then, because of the housing crises, they're not buying order to put around the house or buildings. So we've lost a lot of work there too. Obama appointed Vilsack to be the secretary and invited the farm worker unions to be at the table. And so ever since then, we've had a pretty good working relationship with USDA. We have never been at the table. And in fact, we looked at the USDA as the candy store for the agricultural interest.
Yeah.
Because they were getting all the benefits, they were getting all the procurements, they were getting everything. And there's some major programs, like they do the food stamps, for example, is run out of USDA, and then WIC. So those are huge programs. And so the farm worker movement is trying to work deals out with the administration to benefit farm workers. And they're very open to that. We, Pecún, try to work with most of those groups in different projects. But in addition to USDA, we're really fortunate to have Secretary Hilda Solis as a Secretary of Labor, because she's done some stuff for the farm workers. Primarily, she's overturned a lot of the Bush administration's attempts to bring back the old Bracero program. Bush appointed the head of Monsanto, the largest producing chemical company in the world, to be head of EPA. And So in the winding days of his administration, the secretary of EPA was approving a lot of bad pesticides. We're part of the immigrant rights movement nationally. We are disappointed that we haven't gotten immigration reform yet. We couldn't get undocumented immigrants because that's the population that's the most susceptible to exploitation, and the working conditions are so bad that they perpetuate a lot of health problems, right? Over 300,000 farm workers on a yearly basis are poisoned by pesticides. And so if you look at the state of healthcare among farm workers, it's horrible. So, farm workers suffer 25% more cancer rate than the general population.
A lot of the pesticides and stuff.
Backbreaking work. In the county that I live in, this is a real non-scientific study that was done by some interns. But this is pretty much reflective in a lot of the communities, because what they did is called some of the clinics around the country, and they confirmed that in our county, Marion County, 50% of the farm worker women were suffering miscarriages. So it was 50% higher than the county average. Were suffering miscarriages. We can't pinpoint that it's pesticides, but we suspect it is. But we suffer a lot of different problems. We have a high level of tuberculosis, HIV, AIDS, arthritis, alcoholism, domestic violence. I mean, you go on the list. Farm workers have a difficult life. And so our job is to provide farm workers, first and foremost, building their self-confidence and their ability to organize themselves, becoming empowered to take action. And that's really difficult because we're dealing with an immigrant population that has never been organized. People come from countries in Mexico or Central America where their participation in the labor movement was minimal, or they participated in unions that either had sweetheart contracts with the company or were government run. So when you talk to farm workers about joining a union, they have a whole different concept of what unionization is. They think that a lot of the unions are charros, or sellout unions. So we have an added barrier. And then dealing with a workforce that has never been organized, or very, very few have been organized, we have to develop organizing methods to draw out the limited experiences that they have. And then we're dealing with people that are undocumented, that don't know the area, don't speak the language, don't know their rights. We run into people in the fields that don't even know what state they're in. They just say, we're in the norte. They recruit workers up here and they maintain them like indentured servants.
Like who does that?
Labor contractors. And the growers indirectly wash their hands from responsibilities by hiring a labor contractor. And the labor contractor has developed a sophisticated recruitment method of getting people across the border and maintaining control of the workforce while they're here. And so we're going up against an organized mafia. It's very difficult. For example, in Oregon, there's a law that says only people that are C3 organizations or religious organizations can visit farm workers in labor camps. Unions don't have that right. So the only way that we could go visit a farm worker in a labor camp is if they give us written permission. And so a lot of times when the PECUN goes out and visits the labor camps, they call the cops on us right away, and then we have to show them who invited us, and then the worker isn't going to step up and say, well, I invited that person to come in, because they'll get thrown out. Or even worse, now what's happening is that the labor contractor, the grower, will tell that worker, we'll get you and your family back there when you get back home.
Oh,
so they're threatening the worker.
Threatening their own family back
exactly
in their home country.
So that's the
so
conditions.
So you really do need some changes in terms of organizing, the ability to organize.
So one of the ways that we have access to the workers now is that we have a radio station. So we're able to communicate directly to the workers. That's why for us and for any other organization, the power and the means to communicate with a worker through radio is an important tool, because that's where everybody listens to. We have more people listening to radio than reading a newspaper, because a lot of people don't read because they can't. They're illiterate.
Is that how you get people to meetings?
Yeah, we get people to meetings and we inform people about what their rights are. And so we're always developing programs that are directed towards the farm workers. Right now in Oregon, a lot of the farm workers are indigenous from Mexico. We have, just in the community I live in, we have 16 different languages spoken in Woodburn. Mixteco, Trique, Zapoteco, Miche, Purepecha, on and on. So we're developing programming in that language. In Purepecha, we've been getting a lot of recognition for developing that kind of programming aimed at the indigenous community of Mexico. When I talk about leadership, we're getting people from that community and we're giving them a voice for the first time to come into the radio station. And it's not just being on the air on the mic, you have to prepare. A lot of these folks are not buying their own computers so that they can get on the internet to get their information from their communities, from Purépechas, from Michoacán. Man, they're starting to develop their own organizations, their own hometown associations, the same with the Mixtecos. So the radio is becoming a leadership tool, not only empowering people, but giving people the opportunity to speak to their community and organize their community. The union is not directly involved in that, but it's affiliated, it's associated with the union movement.
So some of the organizing is helping people that come from a particular location in Mexico or somewhere else, like a town, to organize and come together.
If they're not from the same town, they speak the same language. So there's a culture identity that we're tapping into and allowing people to develop and organizing around that particular group and developing programming geared towards that community. All our announcements are at least in 3 languages now: Spanish, Purepecha, and Mixteco. Some of those communities, they're monolingual. They don't speak Spanish. The other thing that we're involved in is we're involved in housing. So we're doing low-income housing for farm workers. Our sister organization called the Farm Worker Housing Development Corporation owns close to 200 units in 3 different towns in the Willamette Valley. And each of our housing projects got a community center where meetings are taking place, people are learning English, citizenship. We have a computer center in each of the communities. The youth are organizing, the women are organizing, the residents have their own association. Each community has an organizer. So when we have a march, each of those communities do their own mobilization. So as you can see, we're developing these different methods of organizing, because the bottom line is that to organize farm workers, it's not like the traditional labor union method. With a lot of the unions do hits, right? They identify a target, they spend some time organizing, they get authorization cards, they get 50% or more. They sit down and negotiate with a company for a contract. We don't have that legal mechanism in our favor. So we have to go toe to toe with the agriculture industry that has everything at their disposal, and we don't have anything. And so what we have is strike and boycott. And those are like 2 of the major sacrifices. What we've done is develop this alternative model. It's actually a model that the old labor union did, was develop a community labor union. Back in the day, organized labor would organize in different communities. In the Polish community, the union would go in there and have service centers or community organizations that had a death benefit, that provided services, legal defense. And so they had that particular community organized in preparation for when they went on strike. The company would traditionally go and pit one group of ethnic workers against the other. So if the Poles went on strike, they'd go to the Italians and the Germans and try to break the strike. So the union started organizing in each of these communities, a labor union in the community. So when the company went in and said, hey, you know, we have work, we'll give you all these jobs, well, the workers knew they were trying to break the strike and they wanted strike breakers. But the union was already organized there. So they developed this method called labor community union. And so that's what we're doing, exactly what we're doing. Going back to the roots of the labor movement, putting the movement back into the labor movement.
And again, it's a combination of community and union, not just union alone.
For the last 6 years, we've built a leadership institute called CAPACES. And CAPACES is getting all these 9 sister organizations CAUSA, PECUN, the Salem Kaiser Coalition for Equality, the Mano Mano Family Center, Latinos Unidos Siempre with the youth organizing, Mujeres Luchadoras, and we're putting it all together, and we're developing leadership skills in two areas, leadership and fundraising. And we're building an institute, a physical institute in Woodburn, which is a 4,000 square feet building, and we're going to build it on donated labor. And the idea is that once the institute is built, we have curriculum on everything that I talked about today. And we're going to share that with all the 9 organizations and other groups that want to learn this model of organizing. First and foremost, I come from a working class background. So, I fit in right with the people I organize. I have no problems working with farm workers. I feel really comfortable. I feel I can communicate. I think I've gained the respect. I wasn't a farm worker. I was never a farm worker. I came into organizing farm workers when I was in high school. So
Yes.
This is the only job pretty much that I've known. I've done some other little jobs here and there, but this is the only job I know. So I fit in right in there. One of the most challenging for me is to develop the discipline that it takes to be an organizer. All the little minute things that organizers have to develop. They have to really develop skills like time management, for example, dealing with your own fears. That was challenging for me. I was a victim of political repression, and so I had a lot of fear. I was victimized, and so I had to come to grips with how that fear was affecting my organizing abilities.
Very good.
So I had to go deep down inside and look at things that I didn't want to look at. And that was fear. And I was able to recognize that, and now I don't have that fear that I had before. And so I become a better person. And then the other challenging thing, I think, is when you come from a working class background, when you come from a poor community, you come from poor education, you don't have the skills, the writing skills, the skills to be analytical, the skills to have a vision. So those were the most difficult things that I had to acquire to become an effective organizer. The most important thing is being honest with yourself and being honest with your other brothers and sisters around you. And if you can deal with that, if you can be the most honest person that you can be, then you're going to go a long way. Because we live in a society where honesty is sort of like a weakness rather than a strength.